the moment before words appear. Have you ever caught yourself in a moment when an emotion is just beginning to stir before you even know what it is? That fleeting instant when something is moving inside you but hasn't yet been named, hasn't yet taken clear shape. Then almost immediately, your mind rushes to label it. Oh, this is sadness. I'm feeling anxious. I feel lonely. And from that moment, something fundamental changes. The emotion is no longer a natural flow of energy, but becomes a problem that needs to be dealt with. We live in a world of words and labels. From childhood, we're taught to name everything. This is happy, that's sad, that's angry, this is love. This linguistic system seems to help us understand ourselves, but in reality, it creates an invisible distance between us and direct experience. Each time we name an emotion, we're pulling it out of the present and placing it into the storage room of the past, where everything has already been categorized, organized, and predefined. But what if the very act of naming is the reason emotions persist, become heavy, and transform into suffering? What if calling an emotion depression is what makes it become an enduring entity in the mind, rather than just a passing wave? What if the I that suffers isn't suffering because of the emotion, but because of the endless remembering, interpreting, and repeating? The trap lies here. When we name an emotion, we think we're understanding it. But actually, we're only replacing a living experience with a dead concept. We're no longer in contact with the raw essence of the emotion. We're only interacting with memories of previous times we felt like this. And in that process, the new has been swallowed by the old. This article doesn't offer a new method to manage emotions or spiritual healing. Instead, it invites you to look at the very mechanism through which suffering is created and maintained. When you see this mechanism clearly, not through theory, but through direct observation, something miraculous can happen. Freedom without effort. Freedom not from controlling emotions, but from ending the entire game of naming, remembering, and identifying. The mechanism of memory. Observe this concretely. You wake up one morning and there's a heavy feeling spreading through your chest. It doesn't have a clear shape yet, just a vague vibration. But within seconds, your mind has rushed to search its database. Ah, this is the feeling of sadness. I know this feeling. I've experienced it many times before. And immediately, your entire history of sadness is activated. The times you felt this way, the accompanying thoughts, the stories you tell yourself about why you're sad. What's remarkable is this: the original emotion, that raw vibration, might have been just a fleeting phenomenon with no fixed nature. But once it's named, it's immediately attached to a chain of memories, a story, an identity. I'm someone who gets sad. I always feel lonely. I have anxiety issues. From a natural wave, the emotion has become part of me. And from there, it has the energy to persist long term. This process happens so fast we don't notice it. Between the emotion and the naming, there's almost no gap. But precisely in that subtle gap, if we can see it, lies the entire difference between freedom and bondage. Because once an emotion is named, it's no longer a simple phenomenon. It becomes a thing that I must deal with, accept, reject, analyze, or overcome. Naming is an act of thought, and thought, by its nature, is the past. Every word, every concept is formed from past experience. When you call an emotion fear, you're comparing the present experience with previous times you felt afraid. You're not actually in contact with the emotion that's present. You're looking at it through the lens of memory. And because of this, you never truly meet the emotion in its freshness. The irony is, we think naming helps us understand emotions. But actually, it only creates the illusion of understanding. When you say, "I'm sad," you think you've grasped the emotion. But in reality, you're only repeating an old pattern. The actual emotion, with all its complexity, subtlety, and uniqueness, has been reduced to a simple word. And in that reduction, its aliveness has been lost. Try this experiment. Next time you feel a strong emotion, don't rush to name it. Just observe. See where it is in the body, in the chest, the belly, the throat. Is it moving? Is it hot or cold? Heavy or light? When you observe like this, not through words but through direct sensation, you'll see that emotion isn't a fixed thing. It's a flow, a process, an energy that's transforming moment by moment. But the instant you call it sad or anxious, it freezes. It becomes an entity with clear boundaries. And from there, the I, the thinking self, begins to intervene. Why am I sad? How can I be less sad? I shouldn't be this sad. This entire chain reaction stems from a single action, naming. So the mechanism of memory isn't just about storing information. It's how the mind transforms a living experience into a dead concept, then uses that concept to create an identity, a story, a continuous me. And this me, built from memory and words, is what carries the burden of the past into every present moment. When you see this clearly, not as an idea, but as a living truth, you'll begin to question the entire process. You'll ask yourself, is it possible to live without constantly naming everything? Is it possible to meet an emotion without turning it into a problem? And the answer lies not in theory, but in direct observation. The energy of attention. Every emotion needs energy to exist. But where does that energy come from? It doesn't come from the emotion itself, but from the attention of me. When I pay attention to an emotion, recognize it, name it, think about it, tell stories around it. These very actions nourish the emotion, give it life, make it persist. Look at anger. Initially, it might just be a surge of energy in the body, a hot sensation, a tightening in the shoulders and neck. Without thought's intervention, this anger might only last seconds or minutes, then naturally dissolve. But what usually happens? The mind jumps in. He made me angry. He shouldn't have said that. I need to do something to retaliate. And from there, the anger is no longer a natural phenomenon. It becomes a story, a chain of thoughts, an action plan. It's this attention, this active participation of me, that transforms a passing wave into a prolonged state. And the strange thing is, me doesn't realize it's nourishing the emotion. Instead, me thinks the emotion is attacking, that it's something external that needs to be controlled or eliminated. But actually, there's no separation between me and the emotion. The emotion exists because me is giving it energy through attention, through identification, through making it part of the personal story. This doesn't mean we should not care about emotions in the sense of denial or suppression. Denial is also a form of attention, a negative form, but still attention. When you try not to think about an emotion, you're still thinking about it. When you try to push it away, you're still interacting with it. And this interaction, whether positive or negative, gives it energy to continue. So what kind of observation doesn't nourish the emotion? It's observation without the observer. This sounds paradoxical, but look more closely. Usually, when we observe an emotion, there's a division. I am observing the emotion. There's a distance, a separation. I stand here, the emotion is there. And in this separation, I has a purpose to understand it, change it, or escape from it. This very purpose turns observation into an act of will, of desire. But there's a completely different kind of observation, one in which there's no separate observer. There's only pure observation. There's no I looking at the emotion, only the emotion being seen. No purpose, no desire to change, no judgment. Only pure presence with what's happening. In this kind of observation, the emotion doesn't receive energy from me. It's not named, not remembered, not turned into a story. It's simply a phenomenon occurring, like rain falling, like wind blowing through trees. And when there's no energy from identification, the emotion naturally dissolves. Not because it's been suppressed, but because there's nothing left for it to cling to. Try this. When an emotion appears, don't do anything. Don't name it, don't analyze it, don't try to understand or change it. Just let it be there, like you let a cloud pass through the sky. You don't need to do anything with the cloud. It comes and goes on its own. Emotions are the same. If you don't intervene, if you don't give it energy through identification, it will complete its own cycle. The miracle is when the emotion dissolves without leaving a trace, the mind becomes clear. There's no accumulation, no burden. Each moment is a fresh start, unaffected by the previous moment. And in this freshness, there's a completely different kind of intelligence. Not the intelligence of knowledge, but the intelligence of sensitivity, of direct contact with life. This isn't a technique to practice. It's not a method you apply. It's seeing, a deep seeing of how me creates and maintains emotions through attention. When you see this clearly, without any effort, change happens naturally. Because once you see that you're nourishing your own suffering, you'll naturally stop doing it. Not because you try to stop, but because you understand. The unnamed state. There's a state in which emotion is no longer sad emotion or happy emotion, but just a pure stream of energy without labels, without clear boundaries. This state cannot be described in words, because any description would pull it back into the territory of thought. But it can be known, not through knowledge, but through direct experience. When you don't name an emotion, something strange happens. The boundary between me and emotion begins to blur, because me is created through naming and categorizing. I am sad, I am happy, I am anxious. All these definitions depend on naming emotions. But if there's no name, then who is me? If there's no label, how can you distinguish between me and emotion? In the unnamed state, there's no more division. There's no me experiencing an emotion. There's only experience, a continuous flow of energy without center, without subject. This doesn't mean you become unconscious or lose sensitivity. On the contrary, you become more sensitive than ever. But this sensitivity is no longer filtered through the lens of me. It's direct contact, unmediated with the flow of life. Imagine you're sitting by a river, watching the water flow. If you start naming each wave, this is a big wave, that's a small wave, this wave is beautiful, that wave is ugly, you'll never truly see the river. You'll only see your concepts about the river. But if you just sit there without naming, without judging, just observing, you'll see the river in its totality as a living movement that cannot be divided. Emotions are like the river. When you don't name them, you see them as a continuous flow. No clear boundaries between sad and happy, between fear and peace. Everything is just different shades of the same energy. And in this seeing, there's a strange freedom. Because once you're no longer imprisoned in labels, you're no longer controlled by them. The unnamed state isn't a special state you need to achieve. It's not a distant goal. It's always here, right now, behind a veil of words and concepts. Every time you stop naming, even for just a moment, you touch this state. It's not an achievement, but a letting go of the need to know, to control, to define. In this state, there's a kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound, but the silence of thought. The mind still functions. It still sees, still hears, still feels, but it no longer constantly comments, explains, names. And in this silence, there's an aliveness that thought can never touch. Because thought, by its nature, is dead. It's the past, it's memory, it's the known. But life is always new, always fresh, always unpredictable. When you live in the unnamed state, you no longer carry the burden of the past. Each emotion comes and goes like a guest. It doesn't leave a trace, doesn't create memory, doesn't become part of me. And because of this, the mind is always light, always ready, always has space to receive the new. This isn't a philosophical ideal. This is a practical possibility that can be explored right now. You don't need to believe in it. You just need to experiment. Next time an emotion appears, don't name it. Don't call it sad or happy or anything. Just look at it as if you've never seen it before. Observe it with a child's curiosity. No prior knowledge, no expectations, no purpose. And in that pure observation, you might catch a moment, just a fleeting moment, when me disappears. When there's no one observing, only observation. When there's no one feeling, only feeling. And in that moment, you touch a depth of life that words cannot express. A depth in which freedom isn't a concept, but a living reality. Suffering and repetition. If you look closely at the nature of suffering, you'll see that it's never new. Suffering is always repetition. It's the same pattern being replayed again and again. The same thought, the same emotion, the same reaction. And it's this repetition that's the problem, not the original emotion. Take a simple example. Someone says something that hurts you. In that moment, there's a sensation of pain, a tightening in the chest, a hot feeling in the face. If you just leave that sensation there without doing anything with it, it might dissolve in a few minutes. But what usually happens? The mind starts telling a story. Why did he say that to me? He doesn't respect me. I don't deserve to be treated like this. Last time he also. And from there, the original emotion, which might have lasted only minutes, is extended into hours, days, even years. This repetition happens through the mechanism of remembering and retelling. Each time you recall the event, you're not just remembering, you're recreating the emotion. You're reliving the pain as if it's happening right now. And each recreation reinforces the pain, makes it deeper, more ingrained in the structure of me. Eventually, it's no longer a single emotion. It becomes part of identity. I am someone who has been hurt. This is how a fleeting experience transforms into a prolonged psychological wound. Not because the original event was so severe, but because it's endlessly repeated in the mind. And it's this repetition, not the original event, that's the true source of suffering. You're not hurting because of what happened, but because you keep making it happen again in your mind. But why does the mind do this? Why doesn't it simply let the emotion pass? The answer lies here. Me needs suffering to exist. This sounds paradoxical, but look more closely. The me, the psychological self, is built from memory, from stories about the past. And the strongest memories, the most vivid stories, are usually memories of suffering, conflict, hurt. They create personal history, create the sense of a continuous me with depth and meaning. If you let go of all these stories, if you no longer carry the past, what would me be? If there's no memory of hurts, successes, relationships, experiences, what's left? This very fear of the non-existence of me, is what makes the mind cling to suffering, no matter how painful. Therefore, suffering isn't just a problem to solve. It's part of the structure through which me maintains itself. And this is why every effort to overcome suffering usually fails. Because the me trying to overcome is the very one creating and maintaining the suffering. You can't use the cause to solve the effect. You can't use thought, which is the past, which is memory, to escape from the repetition of the past. So what's the way? Not a new path, a new method, a new technique. All of those belong to the same old structure. The way, if it can be called that, is seeing this entire mechanism at work. Not analyzing it, not understanding it intellectually, but actually seeing it like you see a snake on the road. When you see a snake, you don't need to think, I should avoid this snake. The action of avoiding happens instantly without thought. Similarly, when you truly see that it's the repetition itself, the retelling of the story, the remembering and recreating of emotion, that's creating suffering, then that repetition naturally ends. Not because you try to stop it, but because you've seen its meaninglessness. And in that ending, there's a completely different kind of freedom. Not freedom from suffering, but freedom from the entire mechanism that creates suffering. This doesn't mean you'll never feel pain again. Pain is a natural part of life. When the body is injured, it hurts. When loss occurs, there's grief. But pain and suffering are two different things. Pain is a natural, fleeting response. Suffering is the prolonging of pain through thought, through memory, through repetition. Pain is unavoidable, but suffering is optional. When you stop repeating, when you stop retelling the story, when you stop making every emotion part of me, pain can still come, but it doesn't leave a trace. It's like a wave hitting a rock. The wave comes, crashes, recedes. The rock remains unchanged, unaffected. Not because the rock is hard or insensitive, but because the rock doesn't hold water. Water comes and goes naturally, nothing clings. This is the difference between an accumulating mind and a non-accumulating mind. The accumulating mind holds onto everything, every emotion, every experience, every hurt, and turns them into memories, stories, burdens. The non-accumulating mind lets everything come and go naturally, without holding, without clinging. And because of this, it's always light, always fresh, always ready to receive the new without being affected by the old. Freedom from oneself. There's a profound question few dare to ask. Is me actually necessary? We take for granted that me is the center of everything. I feel, I think, I act, I experience. But if you observe carefully, you'll see that me isn't a fixed entity. It's a process, a continuous chain of naming, remembering, and identifying. Each time you say, I'm sad, you're creating a me, an entity separate from the emotion of sadness. But is there really that separation? Or is there only sadness and me is an addition of thought? Look at direct experience. There's a heavy feeling in the chest. There are slow thoughts. There's a spreading fatigue. All of this is happening. But where is me in that? Me isn't an entity experiencing these things. Me is the name that thought gives to this entire process. When you see this clearly, something strange happens. Me begins to lose its solidity. It's no longer a fixed entity, but just a habit of thought, the habit of creating a center, a reference point, an owner of experience. But without this habit, without the constant naming and identifying, me dissolves. And when me dissolves, what remains? Not nothingness, not emptiness in the negative sense, but pure aliveness, a flow of awareness, of sensation, of experience, but without center. There's no one experiencing, only experience. No one looking, only seeing. No one living, only life. This isn't a mystical or transcendent state. It's very simple, very ordinary. Actually, it's the most natural state, the state in which there's no intervention of me. You may have experienced it in brief moments, when you're completely absorbed in an activity, when you gaze at a beautiful scene and forget yourself, when you play with a child and lose awareness of time. In those moments, me temporarily disappears, and there's a feeling of lightness, freedom, aliveness. But usually, these moments are very brief, and me quickly returns, wow, I had an amazing experience. And immediately, that experience becomes a memory, part of me, something to recall and long to repeat. This very intervention transforms a living moment into a dead memory. So how do you live without me continuously, not just in brief moments? This question itself is problematic because it's me asking how to escape from me. It's a paradox that cannot be solved by thought. You can't use me to eliminate me. You can't use thought to transcend thought. But something can happen, seeing. When you truly see that me is the cause of all conflict, all suffering, all division, not as an idea, but as a living truth, then me naturally quiets down. Not because you try to eliminate it, but because you've seen its meaninglessness. Like when you see clearly that a road is a dead end, you naturally don't go down it anymore. In the quieting of me, there's a completely different kind of action action that doesn't come from will, from desire, from fear. It's spontaneous action, appropriate to the situation, not bearing the mark of the past. When someone needs help, there's helping not because I want to be a good person, but because it's the natural response. When there's danger, there's avoidance, not because I am afraid, but because it's the intelligence of the body. This is the difference between action of me and action without me. Action of me always carries a purpose, a desire, an image of the result. It's always oriented toward the future, always seeking something: security, recognition, success, happiness. And because of this, it always creates conflict, because between what is and what should be, there's always a gap, a tension. Action without me isn't oriented toward the future. It's completely in the present, completely appropriate to what's happening. It doesn't carry the burden of the past or expectations about the future. And because of this, it doesn't create conflict. It's like flowing water. No obstacles, no friction, completely natural. Freedom from oneself doesn't mean you lose personality or become like a machine. On the contrary, when me, with all its images, fears, desires, quiets down, something completely new can emerge. A creativity that doesn't come from knowledge, a love that doesn't come from desire, an intelligence that doesn't come from experience. And perhaps this is the deepest meaning of not naming emotions. It's not just a technique for dealing with emotions, but a doorway to profound freedom. Freedom from the entire structure of me, from the entire mechanism of accumulating thought. And in that freedom, life is no longer a problem to solve, but a flow to be lived, moment by moment, fresh, non-repetitive. Practice observing the moment before naming. In the first week, start with a very simple but profound practice. Catch the moment right before you name an emotion. This isn't an exercise to do at a fixed time of day, but a continuous attention throughout your daily activities. When you're working, when you're talking with someone, when you're alone, whenever an emotion begins to stir, pause for a second. In that second, don't rush to name the emotion. Instead, just observe what's happening in the body. Is there a heavy feeling somewhere? A tightness? A wave of heat? A vibration? Stay with that pure sensation before the mind jumps in and says this is sadness or this is anxiety. This moment is very brief, maybe only 1 or 2 seconds, but it's incredibly important. It's the gap between direct experience and thought's interpretation. At first, you may find that you constantly miss this moment. The emotion appears and almost immediately gets named. Don't be discouraged. Just recognizing that you missed it is already progress. This recognition itself creates a small gap between the emotion and the naming. And in that gap, change begins to happen. Pay special attention to small, fleeting emotions. A bit of irritation when someone says something, a flash of restlessness when you have to wait, a feeling of relief when you complete a task. These emotions are often overlooked or named too quickly. But it's in these small emotions that you can learn the most about the naming mechanism. Because they're not strong enough to sweep you away, you can observe them more clearly. After a few days of practice, you might begin to notice something strange. When you don't name an emotion, it tends to change faster. It's not fixed, doesn't have clear boundaries. It might start as a heavy feeling, then shift to a light vibration, then dissolve. Or it might transform into a completely different emotion. This shows that emotion, by its nature, is a flow, and it's the naming that freezes it. Contacting emotion without words. After you become familiar with catching the moment before naming, go one step deeper. This time, when an emotion appears, especially a strong one, take time to truly contact it without using words. Find a quiet place if possible, or if you're in public, just pause and direct your attention inward. Close your eyes if that helps you focus. Now, instead of just observing the emotion from outside, go inside it. Where is this sensation in the body? If it's in the chest, Place your attention completely in the chest area. Don't try to change or understand it. Just feel. Does it have a size? Does it have a temperature? Does it have movement? Does it have a color or a shape in your mind? These questions don't need to be answered with words. They're just ways to direct your attention to direct experience. When you observe like this, something miraculous can happen. The emotion begins to speak to you, not through words, but through sensation. You might sense different layers of it, subtleties that words could never express. For example, what you usually call sadness might actually be a complex combination. There's a heavy feeling, but underneath that there's a softness. There's a sense of contraction, but also a wanting to open. There's a feeling of loneliness, but also a longing for connection. All these subtleties are lost when you just call it sad. But when you contact it directly, you see its richness, its complexity, its aliveness. The important thing is not to turn this into analysis. You're not trying to understand the emotion or find its cause. You're just being with it, like you sit beside a friend without needing to say anything. There's a presence, a companionship, but no purpose, no expectation. This practice can last from a few minutes to 15 minutes, depending on the intensity of the emotion and the time you have. But even just 2 or 3 minutes of real contact can make a big difference. Because in those minutes, you're breaking the old habit, the habit of naming, categorizing, and pushing away. You're learning how to stay with emotion without needing to control it. After this practice, you might notice that the emotion has changed, not because you try to change it, but because you gave it space to transform itself. Or you might see that it's still there, but your relationship with it has changed. It's no longer an enemy to defeat, but just part of the present experience. Recognizing repetition. In the second week, start paying attention to how emotions are repeated through thought. This requires more subtle observation because you're not just observing the emotion, but also observing how the mind interacts with it. When emotion appears, especially an uncomfortable one, notice what the mind does with it. Does the mind start telling a story? Why is this happening to me? Someone did something wrong. I don't deserve this. Listen to these stories, but don't believe them. Just observe. This is how the mind is trying to explain the emotion, trying to find a cause, someone to blame, some meaning. In the process of telling this story, the original emotion is amplified, prolonged, turned into a much bigger problem than its raw nature. Pay special attention to emotions you've experienced many times before. Maybe it's the feeling of being abandoned when someone doesn't reply to your message. Maybe it's the feeling of not being good enough when you compare yourself to others. Maybe it's the feeling of anger when things don't go your way. These emotions have something in common. They feel familiar. You felt them before, possibly many times. This familiarity is the sign of repetition. You're not experiencing a new emotion. You're replaying an old one. And what's interesting is the current situation might be completely different from previous times, but the emotion is exactly the same. This shows that the emotion doesn't really come from the situation, but from an old pattern in the mind, a pattern triggered by a similar element. When you recognize this, don't try to stop the repetition. Just see it. See that the mind is playing the same old record. See that me is retelling the same story that me has told hundreds of times. And in that seeing, without judgment, without trying to change, a gap begins to appear. You're no longer completely identified with the emotion. There's a part of you that's observing, seeing the whole process clearly. To clarify this repetition, you can try a small experiment. Write down the main emotions you frequently experience. You don't need to write much, just a few words. Feeling unloved, feeling like a failure, anxiety about the future. Then over the next few days, each time one of these emotions appears, recognize, here's that familiar emotion again. I've experienced it many times before. This simple recognition has a strange power. It breaks the illusion that this emotion is new, special, important. You see that it's just an old pattern repeating. And when you see that clearly, the energy you usually give to the emotion, the energy of attention, of identification begins to withdraw. Not because you try to withdraw, but because you've seen the meaninglessness of continuing to nourish it. One important thing to understand: recognizing repetition doesn't mean you're denying the emotion or dismissing it. You're not saying, "Oh, this is just an old emotion, it doesn't matter." That would be another form of judgment. Instead, you're just seeing the truth, that this emotion has appeared many times, that it's part of a pattern, that it's not new. This seeing isn't judgmental, it's just pure observation. Observation without the observer. After 2 weeks of basic practice, you might be ready for a deeper practice, one that can open up a completely new dimension of consciousness. This is observing emotion without the observer. This sounds abstract, but it's actually very concrete and can be experienced directly. Usually, when you observe an emotion, there's a sense that I am observing it. There's a clear division: I am here, emotion is there. And in this division, there's a distance, a separation. But look more closely. Who is this observer? Is it a fixed entity? Or is it also just a thought, a feeling of me? Next time you observe an emotion, try this. Instead of focusing on the emotion, turn your attention toward the one who is observing. Who is observing? Can you find a fixed observer? Or is there only a flow of awareness, and the observer is just a thought appearing in that flow? When you look like this, something strange can happen. The boundary between the observer and the observed begins to dissolve. You're no longer sure what is me and what is emotion. There's a merging, a unity. And in that unity, there's no more conflict. Because conflict only exists when there's division. When I wants to change emotion, when I wants to escape from emotion. This isn't a state you can try to achieve. If you try, the me is trying and the division is still there. It can only happen when you truly see that the observer and the observed are both phenomena in the same field of awareness. They're not separate, they are one. To approach this, try observing like this. When emotion appears, don't name it. Don't create an I that's feeling it. Just let there be awareness of the sensation occurring. Not, I am sad, only sadness. Not, am anxious, only anxiety. And even the words sadness or anxiety aren't necessary. Only sensation, vibration, energy. In this kind of observation, there's no purpose. You're not trying to understand the emotion, not trying to change it, not trying to escape from it. You're also not trying to stay with it as an exercise. There's no effort at all, only pure presence. A presence in which there's no one present. This might only happen in brief moments at first, and that's normal. Don't try to prolong it, don't try to repeat it. Just know that it can happen. And each time it happens, even for just a second, it leaves an imprint in consciousness. It shows you another possibility of life. Living without a center, living without me, living with emotions as flow. After you've practiced for a few weeks, a subtle shift might begin to happen in how you relate to emotions. You no longer see them as fixed things, states you fall into. Instead, you begin to see them as flows, always moving, always changing, never exactly the same. Now, bring this understanding into daily life. When you interact with others, when you work, when you face challenges, remember that any emotion that appears is just a passing wave. It doesn't define you. It's not your problem. It's just part of the natural flow of life. This doesn't mean you become indifferent or cold. On the contrary, when you're no longer caught up in naming and identifying with emotions, you actually become more sensitive. You can sense subtleties you previously missed. You can respond more appropriately because your response is no longer influenced by old patterns. For example, when someone says something that bothers you, instead of immediately reacting from emotion, from anger or hurt, you can have a moment of pause. In that moment, you sense the emotion stirring, but you're not swept away by it. You can see the situation more clearly, can choose to respond more consciously. Or maybe you see that no response is needed at all. The emotion is just a wave, and it will dissolve on its own. Try living one day, just one day, with the awareness that all emotions are temporary. No emotion is permanent. No emotion defines you. They come and go like weather, sometimes sunny, sometimes rainy, sometimes windy. You're not the weather. You're the sky, vast, spacious, unaffected by the passing changes. On that day, each time an emotion appears, remind yourself, this is just a wave. It will pass, not as a mantra to reassure yourself, but as a reminder of the truth. And observe what happens. You might find that emotions actually pass more quickly than you thought. You might find that many emotions you usually consider big are actually very small and fleeting. After one day like this, try a week, then 2 weeks, not as a strict discipline, but as an experiment. You're exploring a different way of living, a way in which you're no longer controlled by emotions, but also not suppressing or denying them. You're learning to dance with them instead of being dragged by them. And perhaps, in this process, you'll discover that life doesn't have to be a battle with emotions. It can be a flow, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving, always alive, always fresh. Closing. There's a freedom that cannot be described in words, because any description would turn it into a concept, a goal, something to achieve. But this freedom is an achievement. It's not the result of a long process of cultivation. It's always here right now, in the moment when you stop naming, stop remembering, stop turning everything into part of me. When you look at an emotion without naming it, you're doing more than just observing an emotion. You're breaking the entire mechanism through which suffering is created and maintained. You're stepping out of the loop of the past. You're opening a space in which the new can emerge. Not the new of experience, but the new of life itself. This doesn't mean life will become perfect, that you'll never feel pain again, that all problems will disappear. Pain can still come. It's a natural part of life. Challenges can still arise, but your relationship with them has changed. They're no longer problems that I must solve, but simply situations to be faced with clarity, with sensitivity, with intelligence that doesn't come from the past. And perhaps in that clarity, you'll discover that you were never really the person with problems. You're not the sad person, the anxious person, the fearful person. All those labels are just concepts that thought has created. Behind all those concepts, there's something that cannot be named, an aliveness, a presence, a pure awareness. And that is what you are, not you as a fixed entity, as an identity, as a story, but you as a flow of life, without center, without boundaries, without past or future. Only the present, always fresh, always alive, always complete in itself. When emotions are no longer named, when the past is no longer brought into the present, when me quiets down, that's not the end. That's the beginning of a way of living in which each moment is a discovery. Each breath is a wonder. Each emotion is a wave in the infinite ocean of consciousness. And in that ocean, there's nothing that needs to be fixed, nothing that needs to be attained. Only life, simple, profound, and completely free.